Morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the SAFETY Act Application Process for Providers of K-9 Technologies. My name is Kat Kimpton, and I will be your moderator for today's session, and we're thrilled to have you with us. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, and the recording is going to be shared with you afterwards, as well as posted on our website at safetyact.gov as a resource that you can refer back to at any time. All participants are currently on mute to minimize the background noise. But of course, if you have questions at any point, please use the Q&A box, and we'll address them during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. Feel free to use the chat as well with any questions or comments throughout the presentation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We're joined by Carolyn Melnick, who's been working with the SAFETY Act since 2022. She brings a wealth of knowledge to the team, and since we're talking about all things K-9 today, she is a proud owner of a Corgi. So Carolyn will be sharing her insights today, and of course, keep time at the end for any of your questions. With that, let's dive in. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn. Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kat. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am a case manager with the Office of SAFETY Act Implementation, and my role as a case manager during an evaluation is to be that conduit between yourself as a pending applicant as well as our evaluation team as we go through and evaluate whether your technology is qualified to be an anti-terrorism technology for SAFETY Act protections. So the agenda for our presentation today is going to be hyper-focused on our explosive detection K-9 teams, as well as walking through the different aspects of the SAFETY Act, our incentives, the evaluation and application process, and then reference material that you can refer back to when preparing for an application of your own. So starting off with the easiest thing to take away from today is, who is the SAFETY Act? The SAFETY Act is actually an acronym that stands for Support Anti-Terrorism by Fostering Effective Technologies Act. This is a program that was built to incentivize the private sector to develop and deploy qualified anti-terrorism technologies. Our program provides a system of risk and litigation management tools to the private sector to ensure and incentivize them to continue manufacturing and selling products and services to help safeguard the American people. At the bottom of our screen here, you will see 3 different marks of SAFETY Act protections, which we'll get to in a little bit in our following slide. So types of SAFETY Act protections and which one may be most applicable to your technology. As mentioned, this is a process that provides a system of risk and litigation management tools. And there are 3 different options for protections that you may want to consider, depending on where you and your technology are today. Starting on our left-hand side with our green, we have a developmental test and evaluation designation. A key aspect of our developmental test and evaluation designation is a strategy that involves creating a test plan to help gather further information for a future designation. This type of protection is really geared towards technologies that are in their early stages of deployment and may not necessarily have extensive years of effective technology and documentation. So we provide this type of protection to allow applicants to have continuous protections while developing their technology further to one day aspire to a full designation. The terms of protections are usually provided in a limited term, anywhere from 3 to 5 years, depending on the situation. And the evaluation identifies that the technology submitted requires additional information, but there are potentials that exist, right? So for those who are joining us today who may have just started a detective K-9 program and would like additional coverage as they gear up for more extensive technology and documentation, this might be the option for you to consider. Moving into our blue, we have our designation, right? The protections that come with that is a liability cap, which essentially is our insurance requirement and understanding of if you were to be liable for an event, what is that cap that you would be responsible for? Additionally, you would receive exclusive action in federal court with no joint and several liability for non-economic damages and no punitive damages or prejudgment interest. For terms of protections, the designation can be provided anywhere between 5 to 8 years. And during the evaluation for your technology, your application has proven effectiveness with a confidence of repeatability. Those are really two key points, and why they're bolded out in a different color is we would love to understand further about the repeatability of the effectiveness of your technology. And then on our right-hand side of our screen is our red certification. Certification includes all the same benefits of designation with an additional major perk, which is our government contractor defense. If you are identified as certification with the government contractor defense, that means you may potentially have zero liability or need to be responsible for that liability cap. However, it should be noted that this has yet to be tested in a court of law. So we usually have a prerequisite that goes with a designation in order to receive certification. We have that in place. So in the event that a certification protection would not hold up in a court, you would have that built-in liability protection to fall back on in the designation. So the terms of protections for certification would follow those of that designation anywhere between 5 to 8 years. And during the evaluation for certification, your technology is evaluated for consistently proven effectiveness with high confidence of enduring effectiveness. So what I like to tell folks is for certification, we're looking for a longer period of effectiveness data. So our sweet spot is anywhere from 3 to 5 years, pushing into that 5 years of continued effectiveness data, with the designation being that 3 to 5 years. So you can kind of see that we've built a trajectory depending on where you and your technology are when you're seeking SAFETY Act protections. So, as previously mentioned, the SAFETY Act incentivizes with risk and litigation mitigation tools. So what does that mean for me if I want to seek and apply for SAFETY Act protections? What am I actually receiving outside of the moniker of a qualified anti-terrorism technology? Well, for one, your risk mitigation tools, right? Those protections will require that a company is able to obtain and maintain an insurance at a level specified by the Science and Technology Directorate. So during an evaluation, while we really get into the nitty-gritty of your technical, we also want to understand some of your financial and economic information, because that allows us to set that liability cap at an appropriate level for you to obtain and maintain during your terms of protections. That means that the company is only liable for claims arising out of an act of terrorism to that established liability insurance. And that is the amount that you would be responsible for obtaining and maintaining. One critical requirement of receiving SAFETY Act protections is proof of that insurance. Moving on to the other side is litigation, right? The SAFETY Act protections allows for simplifying litigation, where lawsuits can only be filed against the seller of that technology exclusively in federal court. And this may potentially protect suppliers, vendors, contractors, etc., that are part of the technology that receives SAFETY Act protections. Additionally, the limits of certain types of damages limits themselves to prohibits joint and several liability for non-economic damages. It prohibits punitive damages and prejudgment interest, as well as reduces the company's liability if a plaintiff recovers from collateral resources. So these are just some halves of the tools that you may be able to benefit from if receiving SAFETY Act protections. So qualified anti-terrorism technologies means any product, equipment, service, device, or technology that is designed, developed, modified, or procured for the specific purpose of preventing, detecting, identifying, or deterring acts of terrorism. So during an evaluation, your submission material is being evaluated for qualifying as an anti-terrorism technology. The SAFETY Act liability protections can apply to a wide range of technologies. It can be products, services, software, and any other form of intellectual property that can be used across different industries. In today's discussion, we're going to be hyper-focusing on a technology that is a service type. So, the Explosive Detection K-9 Teams is just one example of what a service technology is to be designed, developed, modified, procured, or sold to prevent, detect, identify, and deter acts of terrorism. We understand that there are several types of explosive detection K-9 applicants. One, you are an explosive detection K-9 service provider, meaning you procure, you train, and you offer the service of your K-9 team and your handlers out to end users and customers. Two, you may be a venue operator who contracts out to third-party EDC teams to integrate into a multi-level security program. That means you are someone who is using the services of an EDC team to integrate into your overarching posture, right? And then number three, you potentially may be a venue operator who uses both your own proprietary EDC teams into your multi-level security program. So those are individuals who are a little bit of one and two that may also utilize third-party services and local law enforcement K-9 teams. So these are some of the known types of EDCT team applicants that we actively work with. If you don't feel that you fall into any of these three categories, feel free to reach out to us, and we would love to get to know and understand your technology better to help facilitate you through a future SAFETY Act application. So types of EDC teams. We are using the reference of the ANSI ASB standard for the standard for training and certification of K-9 detection of explosives. We understand that there are three types, and it's very important when preparing any SAFETY Act application for your K-9 service or teams to help us understand which of these three are you offering either to your end users or you're utilizing in your security program. So we have one, our traditional, right? That is the K-9 that is trained to specifically detect stationary explosive devices through systematic search of standing vehicles, areas and rooms, structures, boxes, stagnant bags. Type 2 is person screening or person borne. That is a K-9 trained to detect and alert to the presence of explosives through a moving target on a person-borne source. So these are your K-9 teams that may be patrolling your perimeter, integrating through your crowd at a mass gathering event, etc. And 3, sometimes we have traditional with person-borne screening capabilities mixed together. So that's when a K-9 is trained to detect and alert to the presence of explosives and explosive-related substances in any environment or on a moving person, person-borne. So it's very important to let us know which of these three that you identify as your K-9 technology for an evaluation, because it just helps remove the uncertainty. So if you go ahead and tell us right out of the gate, we identify as traditional, right, that lends itself through the rest of the evaluation for what type of questions and what type of information we should be expecting for that type of EDC team. So I keep talking about applications and I keep talking about evaluation. So what does that even mean and how does that pertain to me? Right. So as you can see here on the screen, our SAFETY Act application has a very robust life cycle. And we have several different types of applications that you can utilize depending on your needs at this time. I really would like to highlight the green pre-submission or pre-application. The pre-submission phase can be anywhere from a pre-application, having a general outreach, having a teleconference consultation with our office to help better understand both sides for what your needs that you're seeking for, but also what resources us as DHS can provide you when preparing for a full submission and application for SAFETY Act. Once that has taken place, then we move into what we call the blue application phase. Now this has many components, and that's where my role as a case manager really feeds into how important it is to have constant communication and open understanding of resource needs and allocations. So during the application phase, someone like myself as a case manager, once assigned to your case, will be there throughout the evaluation process to ensure if there's any underlying uncertainties or questions pertaining to your submission material, right? We have that open dialogue to be in a constant receiving of information. One thing to take away from the SAFETY Act evaluation perspective is that we're always going to ask questions and we're always going to want to know more. And that's not inherently a negative thing. Just because we come back and say, hey, you provided this really interesting tidbit in your submission, could you explain more, does not necessarily infer that you did not submit correctly at the front gate, right? We always want to understand more. So having that constant back and forth during our application phase is very common, and we really welcome and encourage any collaboration from your end when a case manager or our office reaches out for further teleconferences or outreach. Now, for those in the room who might be asking, but Carolyn, how long does this take and can I get it in 5 days? So while we as SAFETY Act are not a regulatory compliance program, meaning we are not here to evaluate what you are doing wrong and telling you how to fix it, we're here to understand the effectiveness. However, we as DHS and SAFETY Act do adhere to a regulatory timeline. And it's very important to distinguish the blue from the green, because the blue, once you hit submit, enters us into our regulatory timeline of 120 days. So from the moment you hit submit on our portal on our website, our clock starts going and we do all that we can in our ability to adhere to that 100-day time frame. Now, our undersecretary does have the latitude to grant an additional 45 days, depending on the needs of that application and the situation. So if we need additional back and forth outreach during the evaluation process, that additional 45 days gives us that buffer. Whereas in the green, we have not entered our regulatory timeline. So for folks who have not experienced a SAFETY Act evaluation process before, or it's been some time and you need a refresher, the pre-application and pre-submission phase is really critical to kind of help get everyone's ducks in a row before entering that 120-day application phase. And then lastly, at the end of our application phase, you may potentially be granted SAFETY Act protections, which then opens up the opportunity for what we call post activities. That can be anywhere from you may have a change in your technology since you submitted, and now you have a new component that was not part of your original submission. We have a process known as notice of modification that allows us the opportunity to add those changes back in. So we understand that technology is ever evolving and never stagnant. So we have things built in place to address those as your technology evolves and grows. Additionally, sometimes you might be provided what we call other conditions. Other conditions cited in any SAFETY Act protections essentially is us continuing that outreach post-signed protections. You may have an opportunity to provide more technical information throughout your the life cycle of your terms. And then finally, there's the annual insurance certification, and that plays back into understanding, are you still able to obtain and maintain those insurance requirements set at that liability cap by the Undersecretary of Science and Technology. So we've gone through a few others, but specifically for today's presentation, we have a very interesting option as well for you to consider, a block designation. So a block designation is the department has established a streamlined process for applicants of certain categories of technologies who may already participate in other government agency programs. For this particular block, we have created one for the Transportation Security Administration, otherwise known as TSA's, third-party K-9 cargo program. For us, it's known as the Certified Cargo Screening Facilities K-9, also known as CCSF K-9s. So this type of block lends itself to who is already participating in TSA's third-party cargo K-9 cargo program, right? And in that process with TSA, you may have already been certified as a CCSF and can offer the third-party K-9 cargo teams. A requirement for applying under this block designation is that you have received that certification from TSA, and it understands that you have met the standards to the TSA regulated entities for the purpose of cargo screening with your K-9 teams. And during the evaluation process, SAFETY Act will coordinate to verify that any applicants who are submitting under what we call block designation 23 are in current standing with TSA's program. One incentive is that this process can be expedited from a 60 to 90-day review for SAFETY Act designation. And as I mentioned previously, a standard review process for SAFETY Act application can be anywhere from 120 days. So if you have not heard of this program before and you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to learn more about this program and refer you to the website in the corner of our screen here, the tsa.gov for Industry Cargo Screening Program. We also will have additional references at the end of this slide deck, so if you weren't able to capture this one, we will repeat it at the end of this presentation. So the next hard part, the application process, documentation. What do you need? How do I give it to you? When will you leave me alone? Right? Well, the answer is we'll never leave you alone, but some of the information that will be really beneficial in preparing an application for is policies and procedures, followed by the narrative explanation that ties together any additional supplemental documentation. So starting with policies and procedures, right? To explain your operations, you might want to provide copies of all your policies and procedures, your standard operating procedures, post orders, or guidance documentation for training, right? That inform the operation of your EDC teams. That can include things such as the hiring and vetting of your EDC team handlers, right? To show that you comply with those stated plans, policies, and procedures, you may want to consider providing additional documentation under supplemental, which demonstrates how your technology, your EDC teams, are compliant to the policies and procedures that you have outlined and cited. This can include personnel documentation, meeting notes, planning documentation, quality reviews of your teams, your audit records, client reviews, and etc. We would also really like to understand, how do you procure the K-9s in your EDC teams? We'd like to understand, are there any policies or procedures for when the K-9s are alert and on the job working versus when the K-9s are not working and not on alert? We'd like to understand, what's the training and routine testing for your K-9 teams? If you are a large venue, right? what is the oversight of any third-party contractors that you might use? Additionally, you may be a canine service provider who may utilize a third party for training and certification of your canine teams. We would like to understand what that dynamic is and what that coordination may look like. Additionally, the housing and kenneling and wellness of the canines are very important. So we'd like to understand, how are you keeping note of the welfare of the canine? Circling back to, if you are applicant number 3 and you are a large venue that has your own proprietary canine service and teams, how are they housed? Where are they housed? Is it any different off-site versus on-site? And then lastly, what's very important to understand, especially for person-born, is the licensing and policies for the certification to store and handle explosive devices. This is very key. Also understanding that as it pertains to training those person-born teams, right? We love to understand the certification process, the training process for the handling and storage and use of those explosive devices for person-born. If you are a traditional service and you are not seeking protections for person-born, right, this might not be as applicable to your needs. But if there is some point in the future where your goal is to expand your services to include person-born, that is an element to keep on your sites as you're preparing for an application or any subsequent application for SAFETY Act. Now, narrative explanation. Narrative explanation can really be an integral part for explaining to us your policies and your supplemental documentation. So what we like to recommend in your narrative explanation is the responses to the questions from the application form. That might seem really pedantic. However, when you are ready to submit for application, depending on the application you are seeking to apply for, there are very specific questions. So in that narrative explanation, feel free to narratively explain your responses and then citing back to both sides of where your policies are, how it aligns to your policies, and then citing the supplemental documentation. This is really important for our evaluation team because it helps create a roadmap and understand where can we look in your submission material that supports that statement in your narrative explanation. Again, as previously mentioned, explain what kind of EDC team type you use. If it's traditional, person-born, a combination of both, establishing that on the front end removes any ambiguity or uncertainty on our part of what type of canine service are you utilizing or providing. And then also narratively, please explain how often your policies are updated and renewed. This might seem pretty generic. However, 5 to 8 years is a long time. And what we like to encourage and understand is how often are your policies changing and updating, or you might have a policy in place that doesn't need to change because it just works like clockwork. Giving us that narrative explanation can also be beneficial because it helps us understand that at least you're tracking and understand what's working and what's not working. And then finally, organizational charts of your staff and a narrative about your business structure. This can be truly helpful to understand the skills and qualifications of your personnel that are associated with your explosive detection K-9 teams. So we would recommend that you consider providing a company organizational chart that illustrates a chain of command. This helps us understand who's all involved in the operations of your K-9 teams, but also establishes if a certain individual goes out on vacation, there are nuances built in place to cover that individual. We also would recommend that you potentially consider providing resumes of those key leaderships and management personnel that illustrates that expertise for your EDC teams, and any other relevant professional certifications, licensings, and education requirements that you may put out for your EDC teams and handlers. So for our supplemental documentation, again, showing us how you are complying with all these. These are essentially the hard stock documentation that might make your eyes go dry, but it underserves and supports the narrative explanation and can cite us to, here's a copy of that certification, here's a copy of that training record. Please see this incident report and results that we do. And then finally, again, if you are considering a block designation for BD23, the TSA's certificate would be a requirement as a supplemental documentation. Now that's a lot of information, and if you have any questions about other information or things that you may do differently with your K-9 teams, please feel free to reach out to us and we can schedule a one-on-one discussion to better understand your needs, your resources, and any additional assistance that we can bring. So for resources, as mentioned throughout this slide and presentation, the standards for training and certification of K-9 detection of explosives. Now this is referencing the ANSI ASB standard. However, it should be noted that this is not the only standard that is required to submit for SAFETY Act application. However, it is a known standard. So if you follow a different standard, please feel free to let us know which standard you use and follow for your policies and procedures, and then cite what that particular standard might be. Additionally, for working resources, understanding federal agencies' needs to better address health and welfare. This is a nice reference to use to better understand the kenneling and housing and health of your K-9 teams. And it just creates a very easy to read checklist that you may want to consider reviewing when you're preparing all your documentation for an application. And then finally, at SAFETY Act, we have already created what we call an Explosive Detection K-9 Technologies guidance paper. So this is a paper that essentially outlines everything I just spoke to you today and goes into granular details about how you might also be able to draft any technology description of your K-9 teams for a pending application. So I really encourage you to seek out this reference. It can be found on our website at safetyact.gov under the reference materials. And the title is the OSAI Explosive Detection K-9 Technologies Guidance Paper. And last but not least, if you are interested in the TSA third-party K-9 cargo program, below is the website where you can read further more about that program, as well as an email address that you can reach out to understand if your service technology for K-9s may be applicable for that program. So I would like to take this time to pause for any questions and introduce one of our esteemed colleagues from our evaluation team. Our technical evaluator, TJ O'Connor, will be here to help assist in any particular questions that you might have in today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was a great presentation. As you mentioned, we've reached the Q&A portion. So this is your chance to ask any questions you might have about what we've just covered. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, please type your question in the Q&A box on the side, and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible as we can with the time we have left. We've actually received a number of great questions already, so I'm going to do my best as the moderator to kind of consolidate some of those. And we'll start with the ones that are most relevant and probably most frequently asked. Just a reminder, if we don't get to your question, we'll certainly follow up with you afterwards. All right, Carolyn and TJ, we've got some great questions on the quantity of documentation necessary. So someone asked, how much supportive documentation should I prepare? Is a certification require more documentation than a designated submission? And I love this question. How many examples are too many examples to include in an application or a submission?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. I'll go ahead and try and answer it first, and then I'll hand it over to TJ to give his perspective as an evaluator. But essentially, as I mentioned, the supportive documentation is really there to help us understand and give clear examples of what you're doing for your policies and procedures and how you're tracking those. So as I mentioned in our presentation, designation is we're looking for years of support. So those 3 to 5 years. So I like to kind of think about it as if I'm going to submit tomorrow, I look back from today all the way to 3 to 5 years. How far back does my policies and procedures go? How far back does my training incidents, my quality assurance, my other supplemental documentation go? That also can lend itself to certification because, as mentioned, certification is really evaluating the continued effectiveness over a duration of time. And that's really our goalpost for those 5 years. So if you've hit 5 years, you may be eligible to apply for an application known as designation and certification in one evaluation. So it's really kind of dependent on which type of protections that you'd like to seek in your application, as well as when is your established deployment of your technology. As mentioned, we also have that developmental test and evaluation designation built in. So if you are a newly minted service or a company that may only have a few years of deployment data as well as end user testimonials, right? Those 2 to 3-ish years might lend itself to that type of submission application. TJ, I'll pass it over for you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. The amount of documentation is really from an evaluative standpoint based on a lot of different factors, and I'm going to try to touch on the most important ones. First of all, it depends on the technology description on how you write it. And a technology description is the legal definition of the services that you're seeking SAFETY Act protections for. In this case, explosive detection K-9 teams, but it can apply to a lot of different things. So we're going to look at the geography that you deploy in, the types of clients that you deploy at, right? So critical infrastructure, residential, commercial, government facilities, etc. And the types of subservices. So you may have a K-9 team, but they may be on fixed posts, they may be mobile, they may be doing other services surrounding explosive detection K-9s. So when we look at your tech description, that's going to really drive a lot of what is our basic element of sample size for your documentation. We try to do a representative sample. We're trying not to cause significant problems for you in collecting data. So we take the technology description, we look at your deployments, we look at the elements of your technology description, and then we also look at your earliest data sale. And that's really important too, because the earliest data sale is when was this technology fully deployed and properly documented. That could be a couple years ago, it could be 5 years ago, it could be longer. We're going to seek a representative sample of data to cover at least the last 3 to 5 years. In some cases, not that long. It depends on the type of documentation we're asking for. And a representative sample is essentially this. It is the documents we're seeking for, training, policies, procedures, quality control, organizational data, etc., that represents all of your technology, either collectively or in smaller pieces. So if you've got, if you're, let's say, deploying to critical infrastructure, residential and commercial, we would want to have a sample of all those documents from each of those deployment towers. Because obviously, how you deploy in a residential or commercial facilities might be different than with critical infrastructure. Now, the performance of the dogs may be the same, but how you manage them, how you provide quality control, how you do performance, and what their posting is could also be different. So a representative sample, when you put it all together, you should be able to look at this data and say, yes, when I look at this information, it talks about my technology as a whole and all my primary deployments. That's a representative sample. To start out with, you know, if you give us 3 to 5 documents of each different type in those deployment towers, we can start there. And in your narrative, just tell us what those documents represent, and also be very honest about telling us what else is available to us. We don't want you to send us 20,000 documents and find out that only a third of them are something we need. Give us a good sampling up front, and if we need more, we'll ask for it, or if we need something different, we'll certainly ask for that. But I will tell you that the key to deciding what documentation you really need and the volume would be best discussed in a pre-application process, where you have us on the phone, we can talk through the types of data, talk through your technology description, and we talk through all the different elements of providing information to have the greatest possibility of success in our evaluation. So that's the primary areas in when you decide how much documentation do I need. Carolyn?
Excellent, TJ.
That's great.
Pat?
Yeah, thanks so much for clarifying the samples and examples. That's really helpful. And TJ, you mentioned a great point about how geography really matters. So we have a question here that says, I'm a company that offers EDC team services, and I have multiple customers across the US. Do you need documentation for each location, or is providing a subset example enough?
Well, if you're directing that to me, I think my discussion a moment ago probably gives you the best answers. We don't need every area covered, but different geographies, different types of clients, again, critical infrastructure, residential, commercial, government, and the types of deployments that you have at each one of those really decides the sample set. If you have such a diverse deployment as having 3 or 4 different markets and towers that you deploy to, we would expect to see a representative sample of documents from all of them. And the geography is really going to decide what the clients are. So if you have a large company and you've got different regions like West Coast, East Coast, Central United States, and they're managed that way, we would want to see samples from each of those geographic regions as well.
Great. Do you have anything to add, Carolyn?
I do not.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so we've got another pretty unique question in the chat that says, I utilize the services of third-party EDC teams, and I use our local law enforcement K-9 team at events. So I'm assuming they must be like a larger venue. They're asking, how do I explain this difference in my submission, and what documentation do you need from our local police department?
That's a great question. I'll go first and then I'll hand it over to TJ. So essentially, when we're talking about large venues like a stadium, an arena, etc., what we really want to understand is the delineation between your services and the oversight and the overlap. As I understand it, you know, the law enforcement K-9s and the State Department, the state issued K-9 teams do not necessarily have to provide specific documentation because we're not inherently evaluating the effectiveness of a, you know, local law enforcement or state. However, what we would like to understand is the coordination. So you have the coordination piece of the oversight of your third-party service that you have, and then you have the coordination piece with your local, state, and federal entities. And what we would like to understand is where's the delineation or separation, and understand who has jurisdiction where on your perimeter, and where does the overlap of any other additional third-party service might be. And then at that point, for your third-party service vendor, we would like to understand what are their policies and procedures that you are essentially advocating them to do on your property, and how are you making sure that what they say they're doing is actually what they're doing. TJ, I'll pass it over to you for your answer.
Sure, thank you. So this is one of the areas with EDCT teams that we come across quite often, predominantly with critical infrastructure. So understanding that the SAFETY Act program is really not designed in most cases to give protections over to law enforcement agencies, we do understand that they play often a critical part of any technology. And there's a difference between what your operational program is and your SAFETY Act program, right? Operationally, they're part of the team, right? From a SAFETY Act perspective, while we see them as part of the team, we look predominantly for our evaluation at what is the areas that are going to get SAFETY Act protections for. So the first thing that would be really valuable to us is in your narrative to tell us about your organization and how these outside teams fit into that organization. Tell us what the chain of command is. With law enforcement canines, typically they have their own chain of command, but there's a senior officer from law enforcement who's typically in a command post that controls those outside resources. We want to know about that. We want to know about that in the organizational chart, the chain of command. We need to know what the team compositions are of these outside entities. But also, one of the important documents we'd like to see is, do you have a written MOU, Memorandum of Understanding with the law enforcement agency for these teams? And if not, do you have some type of delineation of chain of command? And if there is an event, when does the law enforcement agency become the primary command and control and on-scene commander? That's really important, because at some point, the SAFETY Act process is sort of on one side of an event, and then law enforcement first responders come in on another side. So we need to understand where that line is, right? And at the end of the day, typically for these types of things, we look at how does your deployment, how does your management team oversee these law enforcement teams, if they do. Most of the time, you'll get potential SAFETY Act protections for organizing with them, coordination with them, sometimes with the management and oversight, and then also how do they integrate into your overall structure. So that's how we look at these outside entities, particularly canine teams formed by law enforcement, when you look at a broader explosive detection canine program. And I think for the most part, without going into too much detail, that's probably where we should start. And once again, I'm an advocate for the pre-application process. If you use outside entities for explosive detection canine like law enforcement, that would be a good topic to bring up during a pre-application process. Carolyn?
I echo TJ's sentiments. Pre-applications can truly be a benefit for what you need it to be. So if there are elements of your canine program that you're not sure if you should include or not include, to TJ's point, the pre-application is the perfect avenue to noodle those options and to further clarify and understand your coordination efforts with your local law enforcement. Kat, back to you for the next question.
Thanks, that's great. We're definitely hearing the importance of a pre-application, or the benefits, I should say. So that's really great to hear. With that being said, in a pre-application, is that a space where you could help an applicant determine which certification they should apply for? There's some questions here about still not quite knowing which category they would fall in, and is there someone that can help them determine what option to apply for? Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that for folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you are considering SAFETY Act protections and you're not quite sure which avenue, which application, and which protections may be the most appropriate for you, feel free to reach out to us to schedule a teleconference with a case manager like myself, or in a pre-application submission. And while the business decision at the end of the day will ultimately be in your hands to determine which application and which protection type you want to seek, what we can provide is general guidance on, based on what we have intaked in a pre-application or received verbally during a teleconference, right? We can give better guidance on additional information needs that you might want to consider preparing for submission pertaining to that type. So ultimately, we are here to provide that type of guidance if you're not sure which, but ultimately at the end of the day, it is a business decision for you and your company to ultimately make the decision on, but we'd be more than happy to host a teleconference and a pre-application to help you further ascertain which vehicle might be the most appropriate for you and your canines. TJ, any additional thoughts, or you concur?
No, I think that's probably an appropriate response to that.
All right, back to you, Kat.
Awesome. All right, so we're kind of rounding out the hour, so I'll finish with one last question, and that is, Is it fair to say that the process will take 120 days? I'm assuming once they submit their information. So can you just provide any clarity on that before we close?
Sure. The million-dollar question everybody wants to know: how long will this process take once I hit submit? So, as mentioned in our presentation, the SAFETY Act is under a regulatory timeline, and we do count weekends. We don't get the days off. So once you hit submit on your account on the portal, right, it starts our process that can include intake, the full evaluation application process, any type of correspondence back and forth, and ultimately rounding out with a final decision being presented to the Undersecretary of Science and Technology Directorate in order to render a final decision on SAFETY Act protections. Now that's a lot. And the question is, can it really take 120 days or can it take more? The answer is depends. And it depends on your submission material and if there's any additional information exchanges and clarifications that someone like TJ and his team might need to understand during that evaluation. So that's why I know we've harped on pre-applications a lot in this presentation, but that pre-application process really can be the difference between staying on that 120-day timeline, needing that additional 45 days from the undersecretary on how quickly your submission material can be evaluated. Now, again, there's a lot of nuances and things that can add or detract. As mentioned, a block designation for BD23 does not require a full 120 days. But again, that has their own references and requirements as cited with the TSA program. So depending on your technology, your K-9, and what type of application you're seeking, the answer could change. But throughout the 120-day evaluation, myself as a case manager, I am there to kind of keep that on track and provide any additional insight that we might need or you might need to the evaluation team to ensure that that stays on track. So the more preparedness we can be on the front end can usually lend itself to a really smooth evaluation in the middle with a hopefully speedy decision on the back end.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carolyn and TJ, for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us and engaging with such thoughtful questions. We really appreciate it. Just a few quick reminders before we wrap up. A recording of today's session, along with the slides and other resources, will be available online. If you'd like to continue the conversation or learn more, please always visit us at thesafetyact.gov. You can find it right here with the QR code links, as well as listed at the bottom. And we hope that you found today's webinar really helpful. So on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security and the Science and Technology Directorate and the Office of SAFETY Act Implementation, thank you for spending time with us today. We hope to see you at our next event or webinar, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us.